Good morning. Well, our first examination is behind us, and now you're either in good shape or you're not so in good shape. We'll have our second examination 5 weeks from now. All right, today we're going to begin a discussion here. It's going to take a couple of lectures to get through this. It's a long chapter. It's American Revolution. It's chapter 5, by the way, page 129 if you care to follow along in your textbook, and I always hope you care to follow along in your textbook. Let me go back to my documents camera. And we're going to be talking about the American Revolution. It lasted from 1775, actually April 18th and 19th of 1775, and will last all the way up until 1781. And I put in parentheses, maybe it lasted until 1783. The fighting essentially be over by 1781, but it would be 2 more years before we get a peace settlement out of this. So you have to make your own determination there. Did it last 6 years? Did it last 8 years? Whatever. All right, now the War for Independence, which lasted for that period of time, was a struggle. And it was a struggle in a couple of ways. We had the war with England, for number one. We also had the political struggle, and that was a conflict that was within here. And for most Americans, we weren't even sure if we really wanted our independence. There was great stability under Great Britain. And if we did get our independence, what type of government would we establish? Do we want a government with a king? Do we want a government that doesn't have any leadership authority whatsoever? Well, those are big problems that we actually have to face here. Now, the casualties for the Revolutionary War were remarkably light. By today's standards, they were high, but by those standards of those days, it was remarkably light. Let me go back to my camera here and let me give you some of these casualty figures here. And, of course, I always feel like one death or one wounding, is too many. But for the American side, in the duration of this war, the 6 years of fighting, we had only 6,824 killed, 8,445 wounded, and there were 18,500 some odd non-combat deaths, non-hostile deaths is the way we put that. Now, the reason for this, as we pointed out the other day, and I'm not going to show this to you again, if you remember, you had the Brown Bess musket, that 75 caliber musket, which was notoriously inaccurate. For every 300 shots that would be fired, perhaps one would make its target there. And we also had smooth bore cannon. Let me share some photographs with you. Oops, I'm going in the wrong direction here. And I will share some photographs with you of actual Revolutionary War cannons of that period of time. And I took these at various Revolutionary War battlefields. So some of them will look the same, some of them will look a slight bit different here. And I think this one was taken up at Washington's Crossing up in Pennsylvania. Here's another one here, typical cannon that we would find. These are all smoothbore cannons. They would fire mainly solid shot, but you could fire like shrapnel shells with this too. And these are in remarkably good condition here. This photograph was taken of a couple of artillery pieces that were at Saratoga battlefield. And we won't talk about Saratoga today, but we will at a later time here. Okay, so anyway, now America was at a terrific disadvantage for going to war. We only had 1/3 as many people as that of Great Britain. Primitive economic system, primitive military system. And anyway, we'll make some comparisons a little bit later. All right, now, if you remember one of the provisions that came out of the First Continental Congress, and the First Continental Congress, the last provision, will meet again the following spring. So sure enough, we're going to have the Second Continental Congress to convene on the 10th of May, 1775. George Washington did not preside over this. John Hancock did. And it will last all the way until the 2nd of March in 1789. Now, that is intermittently, and they would change their location on a number of occasions here. And actually with this in the Second Continental Congress, there were two strong forces that were opposed to each other. We had one such as that led by John Adams, Samuel Adams here, Richard Henry Lee, that were demanding complete independence, and we had other faction which were rather moderates, and they were taking the position, let's have an early reconciliation, modest reforms from Great Britain, and still continue being a part of the United Kingdom, or Great Britain at that time. So nonetheless here, the Second Continental Congress developed the Olive Branch Petition. This was one last conciliatory appeal to George III, and for some kind of appeasement, some kind of where we can work out an agreement here. We wouldn't have as much of the British oppression. King George III did not have the common decency to even break the wax seal that covered this document, that sealed the document of the Olive Branch Petition. Shortly after that, the Second Continental Congress issued the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms, in which they basically stated the British government left the colonies with only two options: unconditional surrender to tyranny or to take up arms and fight with that. All right, so anyway, now at first, many of these Americans were not convinced we were at war. I mean, we just didn't realize that we were at war. But finally, the cost of the war in lives, the cost of the war just monetarily and money, the British attempt to try to use Native Americans, African slaves, take those forces, turn them against the Americans, and also the British attempt to use Hessians. Now, I'm going to show you an article here, and I'm going to put it on the screen here, and maybe I can get it to contrast a little bit. You can see how you spell it here. This is an article that deals with the Hessians. We'll try from another approach here. Now, Hessians were mercenaries. Hessians were like hired soldiers. They came from an area of Germany which was called Hesse. Some of the officers may be able to speak a little bit of English, but by and large, the troops and most of the officers spoke very limited English. And for the Hessians, they were just dreaded. And particularly up in the New England areas where the Hessians would go through the countryside there, pillage the towns there, abuse, rape the women, and it was just very dreaded. The British made use of about 17,000 of these Hessians. All right, the British also made use, let's see if I have it. Whoa. And the British had made use, enacted the Prohibitory Act. And under this Prohibitory Act, this placed a naval blockade around all the principal cities in the American colonies. This meant that nothing went in, nothing goes out. It's just a naval blockade. All right, shall we move on? And I want to introduce you to somebody else here, and this individual's name is Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was kind of like a Samuel Adams. He'd been a failure in everything in life. He was a terrific propagandizer, however. And Thomas Paine had recently arrived in the American colonies in January 1776. Here's a likeness of him, which is kind of, I think it's the same likeness that you have in your textbook anyway, but Thomas Paine. And he had several quotations here. These are the times that try men's souls. I think it's absolutely absurd that an island would rule over a continent forever and forever in perpetuity. And he wrote this pamphlet, which was called Common Sense. Let's go back here to my notes here. And Common Sense, in which he basically said that it just makes common sense for the British or for the Americans to demand their independence from Great Britain. And this pamphlet served to galvanize Americans. He sold 100,000 copies in a matter of just a few months here, and this would be the equivalent of about 8 million copies today. And this, he alluded to the fact that the King George III was like the Pharaoh of England. All right, so Thomas Paine, I wish you would recognize that too. All right, so on the 2nd of July in 1776, the Second Continental Congress issued the Resolution of Independence. And let's see if I have this, and I'll share this with you, that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent, that they're absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. All right, now what that was written, or I should say read, on the 2nd of July in 1776. 2 days later, on the 4th of July, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was read. Now, the Declaration of Independence was authored by the principal writer, was Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was 33 years of age at that time. He had a little bit of assistance from Benjamin Franklin and John Adams. So what I want you to do is, you imagine this, is that you're given a test, and I know how you probably struggle with research papers, because most people do. But let's just say, for example, here, you're given the task of writing the Declaration of Independence. So here was Thomas Jefferson, and this was his mission: to go back to his boarding house, his boarding room, and sit down with a quill, with a pen, a quill, and a jar of ink, and with a piece of parchment paper, and to draft this Declaration of Independence. Could you do that? And I doubt that you actually could do so here. And he wrote this one night and carried it in the next day and presented it to John Adams and Benjamin Franklin and just said, hey guys, you mind giving this a read through? Give me your constructive criticism on it. And they made a few comments with that, and then Thomas Jefferson took it back to his boarding house room and finalized that document. Now actually what the document is, it's written in two parts. And the first part here is just basically our right for the government to protect our life, our liberty, and our pursuit of property. And the second part of this was alleged crimes against the king. And the king at that time, of course, is George III. So what I want you to do here, and let's take a few minutes and do it. And if we were in a face-to-face class, we would do the same thing. And I want you to take your textbook and go to the rear of your textbook and find page A5. And I'm going to give you a second to do that. That's A5, Appendix 5 in your textbook. And go to the back of it there, and then I'm going to read to you for a few minutes here. All right, so let's go back here. And like I said, the first part of this dealt here. You can read this. The second part dealt with that alleged crimes against the king. So bear with me a little bit here, folks, and I'm going to make the presumption that you are on A5. And notice here it says the Declaration of Independence in Congress, July the 4th, 1776, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. And for the very first time, we're seeing this, the United States. Up to this time, it had been the United Colonies. Now, if you're like me, at some time in your educational background, educational past, you had to memorize this. I know I had to memorize it, and had to memorize it on a couple of occasions, so be patient with me. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands with which each of which connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impelled them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving them their just powers from the consent of the government. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute a new government. That's straight out of the words and philosophy there of John Locke. Now, if you remember the second part of this, it was alleged crimes against the king. So I'm just going to go through a couple of these and look down the left-hand column there on A5, and as we go down about the last one-third of the page, he has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records, for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representative houses and repeatedly for opposing his invasions on the rights of the people. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount of payment for their salaries. He has kept among us in time of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures, for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us. That's the Mutiny Act. For protecting them by a mock trial from imprisonment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states. That's the Boston Massacre. For cutting off our trade with all parts of the world. That's the Prohibitory Act. For imposing taxes on us without any consent. Now, I ask you, who are these alleged crimes against? And of course, I hope you will tell me the King of England, which is George III. All right, so here, I'm going to slide my textbook here under the camera here and get my contrast adjusted here. And if you're looking on A6, you can see those signatories there that sign this. Not all at one time. In fact, it would take several months, before all of these individuals. And notice the name at the top. And very, very bold handwriting there was a signature of John Hancock. If you visit the National Archives in Washington, D.C., you can see one of the original copies that is present there today. And you can see all sorts of other individuals that we're familiar with. Here, over here, Samuel Adams. Over on this side, John Adams is here. Elbridge Gerry, which you'll get familiar with in the next few lectures here. Benjamin Franklin, Benjamin Rush happened to be another. Caesar Rodney, if you take the the Delaware State Quarter and turn the Delaware State Hood Quarter over, you'll find a likeness there of Caesar Rodney on a horse. Let's see some of the other individuals. Charles Carroll, he was the one I was telling you about the other day, that had the 40,000 acres and 285 slaves. Richard Henry Lee, who was uncle or later of Robert E. Lee. Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Harrison, and here we have Edward Rutledge, and we could just go on and on and on. That's a Declaration of Independence. And I hope you folks will understand the significance to our Declaration of Independence, the 4th of July. A lot of people take the attitude the 4th of July is just another day off. It's a day in which we don't have to work. It's a vacation for us. And we think of it as a day in which you can sit around and have barbecue and baked beans and your favorite beverage. But there's a lot more to it than that. And I want you to reflect upon that our next 4th of July. And I try to do that myself here. All right, now one of the basic themes here to the Declaration of Independence: all men are created equal. And I firmly believe that. All men are created equal. Now, great crowds gathered in large cities, such as in Philadelphia, where the Declaration of Independence was read, also in Boston. On the other hand, it is estimated that perhaps 1/4 to 1/6 of all Americans were still very loyal to the Crown. These individuals that are still loyal to Great Britain, we refer to them as loyalists or Tories. And we got a lot to talk about with these Tories and with these loyalists, but not at this time, and we'll do it at some other time. All right, so shall we move right along again here, folks? And I want to stress again. Here we're going to see the first mentioning here of these United States. These United States. All right, so shall we continue with this? Now, for this early government, they're trying to be extremely cautious. We don't want to have a parliament. You do not want to have a king. And so what they came up with was a very weak document called the Articles of Confederation. And I put a date on this, and I don't know if I did this or not. But our country's going to live under the Articles of Confederation from 1777 to 1781. Now, notice here the caution that we're going to take here. And these are some of the things that Congress allowed itself. It gave itself the authority to appropriate, borrow, and issue money. All right, so I'm going to go through that again. It gave itself the authority to appropriate, borrow, and issue money. They could also conduct foreign relations. And Congress could also conduct war. But Congress, being very, very careful, limited itself. And these were some things that Congress prohibited itself from doing, levying taxes directly on the people. So I want you to go up to the first one here, and it says appropriate, borrow, and issue money. Well, if you can appropriate, borrow, and issue money, and you can't levy taxes directly on the people, how are you going to get your money? So the only thing you can do is just print money, and that's just not the proper way to do things. Notice here we can regulate trade. You can regulate trade. You could not regulate trade, I mean to say here, but on the other hand, you could conduct foreign relations. It seems like it contradicts each other. And notice here, Congress was prohibited from drafting troops, but on the other hand, they could conduct war. How do you conduct your war? Where does your army come from? So the only recourse you have to ask for volunteers. All right, it was a very, very weak document here with the Articles of Confederation. And another thing that we have, a problem we're facing here in trying to conduct a war, where do you get your weapons? Where do your weapons come from? Well, you did have the Brown Bess muskets that the British had supplied these colonial militia, and short numbers of those anyway, so this meant you had to resort to trying to capture weapons on the battlefield, you storm British forts and get cannons, or get your weapons which were found there too. Maybe the French would give you some, but one of the things we ended up doing was creating in 1777, this is one of your examination questions here, folks, the first federal armory, some people call it first federal arsenal, in America, and it was established at Springfield, Massachusetts. All right, here's what it looks like here. This is just a small section of that complex. You can visit there today. A lot of things in Springfield, Massachusetts that you can enjoy historically anyway. Inside this building, it honestly is the best weapons museum I've ever seen in my life there. Today, all of this facility is leased by a community college, so we when you arrive there, you get kind of thrown off a little bit. You think, what in the world are all these 18, 19-year-old young people doing wandering around some weapons armory? And that's just not the case. The other buildings are used for classroom buildings, so that's why the students are present there. Okay, so Springfield Arsenal, need you to recognize that, 1777 here. All right, so how is our country, the Continental Congress here, going to conduct the war? So one of the things we did here, we issued continental currency. Now, this was currency. It was not backed by strong dollars anyway. It was backed by the Spanish dollar. We actually printed out, if you will, $242 million of continental currency. It's like going down to a Xerox machine and just copying this currency, and it was practically worthless. Let me show you what some of the currency looked like, and these are all facsimiles. Although you can get these, you can find it on eBay if you wish to do so, if you're a coin collector, currency collector, and I am one of these, but these are facsimiles here, folks. But you can buy these, and they're not too prohibitively expensive. Note that I'm going to show you now that's a real note's probably 30, 40 bucks, something like this. But this is continental currency. It's a $1 note here. Let's see what else we have here. Here's a, if I read it right, I think it's a $3 note, so a little bit different with that here. Let's see what else we have here. Here's a $5 note. Here's a $6 note. I know I'm boring you with this. This is a $7 note, so it doesn't match the type of currency that we have today. Here's one for $65. Here's one for $55. Anyway, you kind of get the idea of what I'm talking about there with the continental currency that we had here. Now, for the British were using gold and silver. They were paying their troops with coins such as this English shilling here. There's a king's shilling. Oops, you can't see that. There's what it looks like right there. This is silver money here. So you can imagine this. If you're a Continental Army soldier and you're trying to buy something with this paper junk here, or the British soldiers have these silver coins here, I don't think you're going to be very successful with this. And you'll find that George Washington, in that bitter winter at Valley Forge, we might talk a little bit about Valley Forge at another time in the next lecture anyway, but George Washington had his starving troops, and he was sending his quartermasters out into the field to try to find food and clothing for his troops, and his quartermasters were going to the local merchants there, and they had this kind of cash here, and they were trying to buy food and clothing, and these merchants just refused to accept it here. On the other hand, when the British would go in with their quartermasters and try to buy food for their troops and use silver coins, it was not an issue whatsoever. It was no problem. And I just so happened to have this coin here. This is facsimile coin, and this is the type of coin in which the American soldiers might be paid in addition to that other the paper currency that you saw a few minutes ago. All right, so what are we going to do for an army? And what we establish here is the Continental Army. Continental Army, and the commander of the Continental Army will be George Washington. Share a photograph with you of George Washington. This is what he looked like here. I don't know if I want to tell you everything about him now, because once he becomes president, I need to tell you a few more things about him. But George Washington, he had experience in the French and Indian War, as you well know. With that, he was by this time he's married Martha, so he's moved into the upper echelon, if you will, in the Virginia society. He's wearing this powdered wig. He had been quite a romancer during his earlier days before he married Martha. Martha had been married before, and her husband died. She had a couple of children here. George Washington had been quite a romancer. People referred to him in the area. They called him the Potomac Stallion. I have to let you use your own imagination on that. Some evidence lead us to believe that perhaps he had a sexually transmitted disease that had scarred his reproductive system, and that's why he never had children with Martha. He had false teeth. Very foolishly, as a young man, he attempted to break open hickory nuts with his central incisors. And you're not going to win that battle here, folks. You're not a squirrel. And it chipped off all of his teeth. He was very self-conscious about it. So he wore false teeth, and not wooden teeth, as many people will tell you anyway. These were teeth that primarily were from a cow. They were cow teeth, bovine teeth. All right, here's another likeness here of George Washington. here, serving as Continental Army commander. Not the greatest commander. He was very lucky, lost more times on the battlefield than he was victorious, but he did provide stability. He provided stability to this fledgling army here. He forced his subordinates to refer to him as Excellency. That's what they referred to him as. George Washington had 2 horses that he rode, one of which was called Blueskin. Blueskin was a white horse. That's the one that you're seeing here in the painting. And he also had another horse, which was a chestnut-colored horse, which was Nelson. And he would alternate between those 2 horses. So anyway, that's George Washington here. All right, now George Washington, like I said, he provided stability, but the Continental Army was very, very weak. And I'm looking around for something here, and let's see here. All right, it was very weak, and particularly with its officer corps. So what George Washington did, he made use of many foreign officers. In fact, it's estimated by the end of the war that 1/6 of the Continental Army officers were actually foreign. One in particular with that is a Marquis de Montcalm. This is what he looked like. This is a photograph of him right here. He was a major in the French army, and he joined the Continental Army and volunteered his services. And George Washington made him, I think it was a major general, 2-star general here. You can see this likeness. I'm going to hold it up in front here so it doesn't get on my microphone. If you're wondering what this structure is, that's my brand new toy. That's a microphone that just came in here, folks. But let me go back to this and, all right, there we go. And anyway, and this shows you George Washington. This was at Valley Forge. The Marquis de Montcalm, it'll be difficult for me to find this. There he is right here, Marquis de Montcalm, and just served as a military advisor to George Washington, also as subordinate officers, and also to the men, too. Another individual, and then I wrote down Marquis de Montcalm, and another individual that is going to be very instrumental with George Washington was his inspector general. He actually wrote the First Army Regulation, the Blue Book here, and we can see this individual. Let me see where I am here. There he is right here, and he was a Prussian. Now, Prussia is part of Germany today. It's the eastern part of Germany. This individual's name is Baron von Steuben, so that you can see how to spell the name. This is the way it is spelled here. Baron Manfred Wilhelm von Steuben, homosexual. I don't really know why I told you that, but he brought quite a bit of order to Washington's fledgling army here. And what Baron von Steuben did as Inspector General, he would go into these various companies and he would select the best soldier that was there, and he would bring that soldier aside in all of these companies. So what he ended up having was the best of the best. He had a company that was very superior soldiers, and he put them through like an officer candidate school, and then when he finished with that, if they technically graduate, he sent them all back to their respective companies and said, all right, I want you to take your soldiers in your company, and you're the company commander, and I want you to train your soldiers exactly the way that I've trained you. Nevertheless, we're going to end up putting together a fairly decent army. We still always had problems with the American soldier here on the battlefield, running from the enemy, and that was not a very good thing to be proud of with that. All right, so let's move on here, and I want to make some comparisons between the British and let's look at the Americans here. All right, so we're going to be working in this section right here. And for Great Britain had the greatest navy. If we look at the Americans had no navy. We will develop a navy and actually do fairly well during this war, a Continental Navy. I've got a great story to tell you about that probably next time we get together. Great Britain had the greatest army, very experienced for the American army. We had the Minutemen. And this is and we also had colonial militia, and as we're slowly putting together the Continental Army, but it was a challenge staying on the battlefield with the British. The British had superior war resources, and for the Americans we had limited war resources. I honestly don't see how we won this war for America here. To me, we should all be speaking with British accents today. Just like I said earlier, we should all probably be speaking French today as a result of the French and Indian War. Now, the war itself is going to last, as I said, for the 6 years. We're going to divide it into 3 phases. I'll go through phase 1 today, which is the New England phase. It lasted from spring of 1776 to spring of 1777. And the British at this time, they weren't even certain that they were at war. They thought the war would be fought in the major cities, such as Boston and New York. And going back to Boston here, folks, and March 17, 1776, the British troops left Boston. It is a day still celebrated annually in Boston. It's called Evacuation Day. And the British are going to sail away. They're going to Nova Scotia, to Halifax, Nova Scotia. All right, don't worry, they will be back in the colonies here. All right, now during this first phase, and give me a chance to go back and find something in my textbook here, my friends, and I want to share a map with you, and I'm going to put this here for you to read with the documents reader here. Let me adjust my lighting on it so you can actually read here. And this is phase 1. And in phase 1, what the British were going to do, and by the way, this shows you the evacuation day there. But what the Americans were going to do, that's what I meant to say here. They sent an element up the Hudson River here. This is under General Schuyler. Notice the name that changes right here to Richard Montgomery. Actually, General Schuyler, got sick and he had to turn back. And then Richard Montgomery will lead the troops here. And what we're going to try to do here is take the city of Quebec. Now, concurrent with that, we had another group of Americans that will go up the Kennebec River here in Maine. This was led by Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold was a great American fighter, and I know I sound like I'm committing treason with that. He's one of our most hated traitors to our country, but actually Benedict Arnold was a masterful commander on the battlefield. We referred to him as the American Hannibal. All right, and he was very grievously wounded here, and both Montgomery and Arnold were able to make their way to Quebec, but enlistments, these one-year enlistments, were about to expire, so instead of being able to weather out a siege and force the British to surrender there, we had to, because we were afraid our troops would just vanish after their enlistments expired, we had to rush the attack in Quebec. And I'm sorry to tell you folks, we didn't do very well with that by any means here too. All right, so I want to take you to another engagement, and this will be the last one we talk about here. And if we were in class, I would design this for you, outline this for you much, much better. But if we look at the battle that's going to take place at Bunker Hill. Bunker Hill, the engagement took place on the 17th of June in 1775. So that I don't have to come back to this in a second here, folks. 2 Americans that are quite noteworthy in this time at this battle. We had a William, here's the way you want to pronounce the name, Prescott. Prescott is not Prescott, as we would say in Walker County, but it's Colonel William Prescott, and the other was General Israel Putnam. All right, so 2 noteworthy individuals here. So let me move my cover sheet over there, and I'm going to flip back to my documents camera and go back beyond me. Let's see if I can lighten this a little bit. And I want you to look over my shoulder. All right, and this shows you a map of Boston. Let me get you oriented to this. This is where Boston is located right here. This is known as Boston Neck, where the Boston Tea Party took place, was right here. All right, and the British have occupied all of this area. Now, this is before the evacuation day now, so we still had the British that were present there. And where George Washington's troops were, they were around here, and also over the Charlestown Peninsula, which is present there. And Patriot spies let us know that the British were up to something. And the British, we know, we can go down into the bars there, we know the British are up to something, and we get a pretty good feeling that they're going to try to take the high ground that's around Boston. That high ground would include Dorchester Heights, which is right here, and it would also include the high grounds that are over at Charleston, right across the Charles River. This is the Charles River that is present there. So for these Patriots began to, they were over Charlestown Peninsula, they began to dig in. Up here, in this area here. Now there's actually 2 hills that are present here. Where my marker is present is a hill of lesser elevation. It's only 75 feet in elevation, and that's Breed's Hill. The hill behind it is Bunker's Hill. Bunker Hill is 125 feet in elevation. But what the 2 individuals I mentioned earlier, Prescott and Putnam, decided to do is that they would defend Breed's Hill more strongly than they did Bunker Hill. So they're going to set up their redoubt and this readout's going to be right in this position, 132 feet. And let me see if I can find a likeness here, and I'll try to show it to you like this, showing you what this readout appears as here. So this means that we take several hundred men, maybe 1,000 men, and we have them in this position, and every man has a shovel, and as you take your shovel and you dig a spade full of earth, then you throw it up to the side. You throw it up here, such as this. So when you have 1,000 people that are digging such as that, you create a trench for yourself. It's called a redoubt, and you create a parapet wall there in which you can hide behind here. All right, and then following that, what the Americans did, let's go back to my map over here. Let me get my pointer here. And it had a 132-foot redoubt that was present here, and then they constructed a 300-foot like a barrier, like a fence that you could hide behind here. And then they realized when they got down here that they could still be flanked, so they constructed another fence, and this was a rock wall that went down such as this. All during this time, the British are present over here in this area, and the British are taking time to cook meat, bake bread, and prepare rations for 3 days. And so the British are largely wasting time. And for the Americans that are over at the Charlestown, in Charlestown itself, across the Charles River, they're just digging in deeper and deeper and deeper. So in the late afternoon, here came the British. They were coming in columns of boats, 2 boats, parallel boats, coming across here, from here over to Malton's Point, right here. And when they attacked, they went just Marine Corps style, hey diddle diddle, right up the middle. Let me share this with you here. And this shows you the British here in this artist rendering coming up. Neat little formations there. The Americans are up at the top of the hill. They have the fifes and drums going. Neat formations there. The officers wore different hats and enlisted. So what the Americans were doing, the Americans were actually sharpshooting and trying to kill the officers, and they ended up doing so. They killed and wounded many of these officers. And the British failed. The British regrouped, and when they did, they made a second attack around to the flank right here, and they were repulsed there. And they turned around and made a third attack, went straight up the hill there. By this time, the American patriots that are on the top of Breed's Hill have run out of ammunition, run out of gunpowder, have no other option except to flee the battle scene here. About 30 remained at the top, and they were throwing rocks at the British, and all of those individuals were captured. So by and large, it was a British victory here at Bunker Hill, but let's take a look at the casualty figures for this. For the British losses, the British lost 1,050 out of 2,400. Those were wounded. 250 of those later died. They had 226 outright killed. 92 officers killed or wounded. This was 1/6 of all the officer losses in the entire war were lost there at Bunker Hill for the British. For the American losses, we had 271 wounded, 140 killed, and the 30 rock throwers at the top of the hill were actually captured right there. Alrighty, my friends, that takes us through Bunker Hill. It also takes us through the first phase of the American Revolution. We have 2 more phases to talk about, and I'll get through both of those in the next lecture here. We have a long war in front of us. I encourage you to visit these Revolutionary War battlefields. Go to Bunker Hill. I want to show you this. I almost forgot this, but I want to go back to my camera here for just a second here, because when you do go to Bunker Hill, you'll find the Bunker Hill Pavilion. This is what it looks like. Let me show it from this position. Seems like I can get better contrast here. From this position here, the Bunker Hill Pavilion is run by the National Park Service. You can actually take the elevator up to the top. You get a panoramic view here of Boston. Here's another photograph of the Bunker Hill Monument, if you can get it in focus there. And down at the foot of it, you'll see a statue there of William Prescott, the guy I was telling you about earlier, who was one of the heroes of Bunker Hill. All righty, thank you very much for your attention, and I'll see you next time we get together with lecture number 10. All right, thank you.